Good day, everyone. Today we will talk about the Agricultural Tenancy Act, also known as the Republic Act number 1199. This law was made in 1954 during the time of President Ramon Magsaysay. It was created to promote social justice to make sure that both farmers and landowners have fair relationships. Now let us move on to Agricultural Tenancy Act. The Agricultural Tenancy Act aims to create clear and fair rules between farmers and landowners. It protects the right of both sides and makes sure that everyone gets their equal share of the crops and income. For example, when a farmer plants rice on land that belongs to someone else, this law helps decide how much each will get after harvest. That way, there's no cheating and both the farmers and the landowners are protected by law. Now let us move on to the objectives of the Act. The goals of this law are very important. First, to control and guide the relationship between landowners and tenants. Second, to make sure crops and income are shared fairly. Third, to protect farmers so they can continue working safely. And last, to make farmer productive and the countryside peaceful. In short, this law helps farmers live better lives and promotes fairness and peace in rural areas. Now let us move on to the definition of agricultural tenancy. So what is agricultural tenancy? It simply means that a farmer called a tenant works on land that belongs to someone else called the landowner. The farmer provides the labor while the landowner provides the land. Then, both share the harvest or the farmer pays rent for using the land. For example, if Juan plants corn on Mr. Cruz's land, after harvest, they divide the corn or money. That's agricultural tenancy. Now let us move on to the types of tenancy. There are two types of tenancy. First is the shared tenancy and the second is the leasehold tenancy. So the shared tenancy, it is where the farmer and the landowner share the work and divide the harvest after. While the leasehold tenancy, it is where the farmer pays a fixed rent either in money or crops to use the land. For example, if Juan gives half of this harvest to Mr. Cruz, that's shared tenancy. But if Juan pays a certain amount of rice every year, that's leasehold tenancy. So this law makes sure that both sides agree fairly and no one is treated unfairly. Tenant versus landlord. A tenant is a farmer who works on land owned by someone else with permission. A landlord is a person who owns the land and allows the farmer to plant there. So the tenant uses his hard work to grow the crops, while the landlord provides the land. Both must respect each other and follow the law to keep the relationship fair and peaceful. For example, if Maria farms on Mr. De La Cruz's land, Maria is the tenant and Mr. De La Cruz is the landlord. This law makes sure that both work together with respect and fairness.
Agricultural year. This is when the farming cycle begins, like not necessarily the calendar year, but it includes all steps like preparing the land, planting, and harvesting for crops with multiple harvests like coconuts or coffee. Agricultural year is from land preparation to the first harvest, and then from one harvest to the next. It's basically a cycle uh, that happens every agricultural year. Moving on to tenancy relationship. This is the legal relationship between a landlord and a tenant. So what is a tenant? It is a person who occupies the land or property rented from a landlord. It can be tenancy relationship can be created with a spoken agreement or a written contract. Once established, the tenant has security of tenure. So meaning they have the right to keep farming the land. This relationship is strictly between the landlord and the tenant. The landlord is the person who provides the land, and the tenant, the person who personally works the land. So how does tenancy relationship end? A tenancy relationship can only be ended in a few specific ways. First one is a voluntary surrender. So This means the tenant freely and willingly gives up the right to farm the land. Second one is death or incapacity of the tenant. That means if the tenant dies or becomes unable to work, the relationship ends. However, their family can continue farming until the current agricultural year is finished. What does not end the tenancy? The contract expiring does not actually automatically end it. The land being sold does not end it. The new owner must step into the shoes of the old landlord and honor the tenancy agreement.
Freedom to contract or tenancy contract. The landlord and tenant can make their own fair and legal agreements. This means that both the landowner and the tenant has the freedom to make any tenancy agreement they both agree on, as long as it follows law and moral standard. Once the contract is written and registered properly, it becomes their legal proof of their agreement unless one of them challenges it within 30 days. So, for example, a landowner and the tenant agree that the farmer will plant a rice on a piece of land and share the harvest equally. They write and register the contract at the municipal office. After 30 days with no objections, it becomes legally binding. Registration of tenancy contract. The municipality treasurer of the town where the land is located must keep a record of all tenancy contracts. All tenancy contracts must be recorded and stored at the municipality treasurer where the land is located. This is called the registry of tenancy contract. All the changes of the contract like renewal, cancellation, or adjustment must also be recorded. Also, there are no taxes charged for changing or registering this contract. Right to change the tenancy contract. Tenant may change from the short tenancy to leasehold or vice versa after contract or agricultural year ends, with notice to landlord. This means that a tenant farmer has the right to change the type of contract with the landowner. For example, from a short tenancy or sharing harvest to leasehold tenancy or paying rent for land use. If the contract is written and registered, the change can be made when the contract ends. And if there is no written contract, the change can be made at the end of the agricultural year. The new system like leasehold will take effect 1 year after the tenant informed the landowner of the change.
Rights of the tenant. First is the tenant may work elsewhere temporarily. This means that the tenant can work other jobs if it doesn't interfere with farm duties. Second is tenant can provide materials or money for production. It means that the tenant can add his own resources like seeds, fertilizers, tools, or money to help with farming. Third is tenant cannot be removed from his house or land without consent or legal reasons. The tenant cannot be forced to leave his house or land without consent unless the tenancy relationship is legally ended or has legally ended, or the tenant is lawfully dismissed for a valid reasons, and even then, only after 45 days. Fourth is, tenant can be moved or paid for his house if dismissed unfairly. If the tenant is removed without just cause, he can take down his house and move it elsewhere, or ask the landlord to pay for the value of his house. Fifth is, tenant must be paid for his work and expenses if removed without just cause. If the tenant is removed without valid reasons, he must be paid for his labor and expenses, including work done for cultivation, planting, harvesting, and any improvements he made for the crops and or land. Six is, tenant decides planting, transplanting, and harvesting schedules without notice and good practices. The tenant can decide when to plant seeds or when to transplant seedlings and when to harvest. But this must follow proven farming practices, and the tenant must notify the landlord. Seventh, the tenant can choose the thresher unless the landlord offers one at equal or lower rate. The tenant can choose whether a thresher or machine that separates grape from plants will be used for the harvest. It should be the best one available in the area, suited for both the tenants and landlord's needs, and offered at a fair or lower price compared to others. Number 8, the tenant can apply pest control, but if he ignores the landlord's written request, he's liable for the damages. The tenant can apply pest control whenever needed, but if the landlord requests in writing for these measures to be done and the tenant fails to do it, then the tenant will be responsible for the loss that results. It means that the tenant must protect the crops from pests. If he ignores the landlord's request to do so, he'll pay for the damages. Number 9, tenant can choose fertilizer unless the landlord requires a specific kind. The tenant may use fertilizer that are proven and suitable for the land. However, if the landholder specifically requires a certain fertilizer, the tenant must follow that. It means that the tenant can decide which fertilizer to use, unless the landlord provides a specific instructions. Obligation of a tenant. A tenant must cultivate and care for crops and improvements. The tenant must manage the farm, crops, and other improvements responsibly, like a good father of a family. He must do all necessary farm work according to proper farming methods. Next is, the tenant must inform landholder of trespass or damage. If someone enters or damages the land without permission, the tenant must immediately report it to the landholder. Maintain farm tools and animals. Tenant must properly care for animals like carabaos and farm tools given by the landholder. He cannot use them for personal purposes or let others use them without the landholder's permission. Tenant shall not abandon or surrender his holdings without justice. The tenant cannot abandon or leave the farm and crops without a valid reason. If he leaves without permission, he might lose his right to his share of the harvest, and the landholder may claim part of all the crop's value as decided by the court. Just and reasonable cause for tenant to terminate the relationship. Cruel or inhuman treatment. If the landholder or their representative treats the tenant or their family cruelly or inhumanly or offensively, the tenant can leave the land. Example, if the landlord insults, abuses, or physically harms the tenant or their family. Next is, tenant can leave if landlord breaks contract or law. If the landlord fails to follow the duties or obligations stated in the law or the contract, the tenant has the right to end the relationship. Example, the landlord does not give the agreed share of harvest or refuses to fulfill what was promised in the contract. Next is forced unpaid work. Forcing the tenant to do the unpaid or unrelated work. If the landlord forces the tenant or their family to do work not related to farm duties or makes them work without pay, the tenant can end the relationship. Example, the landlord tells the tenant to work on the landlord's house or personal businesses without pay. That is illegal. And last is crime by landlord. If the landholder or their representative commits a crime against the tenant or tenant's family, the tenant can terminate the tenancy. Example, thief, assault, or criminal act toward the tenant or their family. Prohibition of tenant. Tenant cannot handle multiple lands without landlord's consent. If the tenant already manages a large farm or is busy with his own land, he cannot work on another land under tenancy system without telling and getting consent from his original landholder. Next is, tenant cannot be hired subtenants unless seek with notice. A share tenant or who shares harvest with the landlord cannot hire someone else, or also known as subtenant, to do the farm work for him. The only exceptions are if the tenant becomes sick or temporarily unable to work and the tenant informs the landlord about it. Last but not least, tenant cannot sublet or lease land to others without permission. A leasehold tenant who rents the land for a fixed amount cannot rent out or transfer the land to another person without the written consent of the landholder.
Rights of the landholder. The first one is right to choose kind of crop and seed. Landholders generally possess the right to decide which crops are planted in their land and which seeds are used. The second one is require use of fertilizer and proven practices. Landholders can stipulate the use of fertilizer and specific farming practices to maintain soil fertility and achieve optimal yields. The third one is inspect tenant compliance. Landholders have the right to inspect their property to ensure tenants comply with lease terms and maintain the land appropriately. The last one is determine harvest and irrigation system. Landholders can determine when crops are harvested based on maturity and market conditions, as well as influence the choice of irrigation system for efficient water use. The selection of an irrigation system depends on factors like crop type, field size, and water availability. Obligations of the landholder. The first one is respect tenants' rights. The landholders are legally required to respect all rights afforded to tenants, including the right to privacy, fair housing, and peaceful enjoyment of the property. This ensures a fair and lawful tenancy. The next one is provide fair sharing agreement. In situations where the landholder and another party agree to share resources or profits, A fair agreement must be established. This outlines how profits, expenses, and responsibilities are divided, ensuring transparency and equity. The last one is maintaining fair sharing agreement. Landholders must adhere to the terms of the sharing agreement, making necessary adjustments and communicating openly to address disputes or changing circumstances. This preserves trust and fairness over time. Prohibitions to the landholder. The first one is cannot evict tenant without just cause. Landholders cannot evict a tenant without a legitimate reason, such as failure to pay rent or violations of the lease agreement. The last one is cannot demand unfair rent or fair dispose. Landholders are prohibited from charging excessive rent or demanding an unfair share of profits. Rent control laws and fair practice standards prevent financial exploitation.
We will be discussing the basis of sharing. This part explains how the harvest, palay, or rice is divided between the landowner and the tenant lessee. So, there are two types of land, the first class and the second class, and the sharing depends on how productive the land is. So, the first one is the first class land. So, these are lands that produces more than 40 cabins of rice per hectare on average over 3 years. And the harvest is divided based on the contributions of both parties. So if you contributed the land, you will get 30% of the share in the harvest. If you contributed the labor, you will get 30%. And if you contributed the farm implements or tools, you will get 5%. If you contributed the work animals, you will get 5%. And the final harrowing of the field immediately before transplanting, you will get 5% of the share. And next is the transplanting, you will get 25%. This means each person's share depends on what they contributed. The next is the second class land. These are lands that produces 40 cabins of rice or less per hectare. So the division changes slightly to be fairer to the tenant because the land is less productive. So if you contributed the land, you will get 25% of the share. If you contributed the labor, you will get 35% of the share. So the tenant lessor is the owner or the person who is in charge of the land. It can be a lessee or a legal possessor. They let someone use of the land in exchange for payment or the share in harvest. Next is the tenant lessee, the farmer who works and cultivates the land with the landlord's permission. He may work alone or with the help from his family. So, ang landlord lessor is yung may-ari ng land, and the tenant lessee is the farmer who rents the land. Next is the rights and obligations of the tenant lessee. So the tenant's rights include he can enter and use the land peacefully. He can farm using his own methods as long as they are good and proven farming practices. Next is when the tenancy ends, he gets half of the value of any improvement he made, like building dikes or irrigation, as long as they are reasonable. Next is the tenant's obligation. The tenant is obliged to pay the agreed rent or share not exceeding the legal limit. Next is he must use and take care of the land properly, like as a good father of a family. So dapat he should treat the land like his own family, like his own children. Next is when the tenancy ends, Next is he must take good care of any animals or tools given by the landholder. So if the landholder lets him borrow some of the animals or tools, he should also take good care of it. Next is the rights of the landholder lessor. The landholder lessor has the right to inspect the farm to see if the tenant is following the contract and the law. However, the landlord cannot use force, threats, or intimidation toward the tenant. So the landholder has the right to inspect whether the tenant is following the contract or not. But hindi niya pwedeng i-intimidate yung tenant kasi we have a law. You should not use any form of violence toward the tenant. That's all.
Ejectment of the tenant. When you say ejectment of the tenant, ibig sabihin nito ay may isang pagpapalis ng isang magsasaka o tenant sa lupang sinasaka niya. Now, according to the law, kahit may kasunduan or period sa kontrata, hindi ka pwedeng basta-basta magpalis ng isang tenant. He cannot be dispossessed, meaning hindi siya pwedeng tanggalan ng karapatan sa lupa unless there's a valid reason at dapat mapatunayan sa korte. So before the tenant can be removed, there are two important conditions. Una, may tamang dahilan ka o valid cause. Pangalawa, may approved from the court. So in short, the purpose of this law is to protect the rights of the farmers. Now, let's move on the final provision. This part that explain the punishment for anyone who violates this law. So kapag nagpalis ka ng isang tenant or magsasaka nang walang pahintulot sa isang korte, pwede kang ma-violate our punishment by a fine up to 2,000 or makulong ng 1 year or both depending sa decision ng isang court. Now, let's talk about the flaws of Agriculture Tenancy Act. This law was created during the time of President Ramon Magsaysay, and the goal was to help the farmer and distribute land of them. They planned to distribute over the 300 haciendas to the farmers, but after 7 years, only 41 were actually distributed because the main reason of lack of fund and cooperation from the landlords.
And that's the end of our report about the Republic Act number 1199. Thank you for watching and listening. Have a great day.